once marketed as the man Jack Johnson is afraid to meet. And in an interview, Jack Dempsey confessed he was the only man who struck fear into his heart. The plight of a dark-skinned fighter in the early years of the 20th century was often an unfulfilling career, even more so if you were good. And Sam Langford was a born fighter. Possibly the only fighter throughout boxing's rich history in which weight classes truly served no purpose. And it is a tragedy that a pugilist of his caliber has become largely forgotten, and even more so, that he was seldomly honored in his own time. Sam Langford, a boxing legend.
Sam Langford was possibly the greatest fighter who ever lived. Here was a man who weighed anywhere from 145 to 160 pounds, and within a short time, very few heavyweights would risk their undefeated record or risk the title against him.
He could call a round better than Ali. One time he comes out for a round, and I don't know if it's second or third, and he touches gloves, and the opponent says, "What are you touching gloves for? This isn't the last round." He said, "For you it is."
Sam was born in 1886 in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. By the time he was 15, he had made his way to Massachusetts, where he found his calling as a fighter and would later become known as the Boston Tar Baby. Langford was no ordinary man. Inordinately long arms with bone-crushing power in both hands and an uncanny sense of distance. Spectators were continually baffled how a man standing only 5 feet 7 inches tall could batter even the biggest heavyweight contenders. Sam was a pioneer for the technical side of boxing and a connoisseur when it came to punishing a fighter's vital spots.
How have I not ever heard of this guy before? Some of his contests were 60 to 100 rounds.
Nova Scotia Sam Langford was one of the greatest boxers of all time. ESPN also ranked him the second hardest puncher of all time. Small man with a big punch.
Langford's first encounter with greatness was against the lightweight legend Joe Gans. Gans was the first ever African-American to win a world title. Even the most bigoted of reporters declared Gans to be the greatest fighter the ring had ever seen.
Joe Gans triumphed at the start of the 20th century, holding the lightweight crown for 6 years.
Gans dominated the ring. He became known as the Old Master. He won 158 of his 196 fights.
Joe Gans was unbelievable. His defense, his jab. I mean, here is the man who invented it. He was that good.
Sam was only 17 years old when Gans was 29. The Old Master introduced Langford to a level of boxing he'd never dreamed existed. But that didn't stop Sam from giving Gans the unholiest of lickings. One reporter covering the fight felt Sam beat the champion in a manner that left no doubt, and Gans, who was at one point out on his feet, later acknowledged in agreement. Langford had won, but at the weigh-in, Langford failed to make the 135-pound limit, and he would not be awarded the title. Less than a year later, Sam was matched up with the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott. At that time, he was considered by the majority of boxing authorities as the greatest welterweight champion ever.
He'll go down in the history, along with the original Joe Walcott, as the greatest welterweight champion ever had.
He was the first man to put a little fear into Langford. He also had a reputation for knocking out larger men. But knowing the title was on the line, Sam put on a scientific slaughtering. Langford was able to draw blood from the champion's mouth, and by the final bell, the crowd felt Walcott had met his master. Controversially, the fight was ruled a draw, a decision that displeased many of those in attendance. A few years later, Walcott would be knocked out by a fighter called Young Peter Jackson, who would later be convincingly beat by Langford, further solidifying Langford's claim as the best fighter in the welterweight division.
He started his career a healthy lightweight, but he always had his eyes set on going for the heavyweight division.
Around that time, there was another black fighter who was garnering praise from the boxing world, Galveston's Jack Johnson.
One of the most formidable fighting machines in boxing history, a man who was to stand overwhelmingly supreme above the other fighters of his era.
At his best, he was a superb athlete and considered by many the best defensive fighter in the sport.
Johnson was destined to become the heavyweight world champion, and Sam wanted to be the man to derail Jack and better his own reputation. 28-year-old Johnson, who stood at 6 foot 1 inches, had 30 pounds on the 20-year-old Langford. Regardless of their admiration for Langford, even his fans didn't believe he would go the distance. Early in the fight, Johnson hit Langford with a left that bladed his mouth. In the 6th, Jack drove a right uppercut into Sam's chin and sent him crashing to the canvas. Again in the 8th, a left hook directly to Langford's mouth put him right back on the mat. But Sam got up and was also able to demonstrate his finesse as he cleanly landed a right to Johnson's jaw after feinting to the body. In the 9th, Langford landed a left hook to Johnson's midsection that caused him to drop his guard and gasp for breath. The fight went the distance, both men bloodied and bruised. There was no doubt in the spectators' minds that Johnson was the victor. But little Sam won the heart of the crowd, and he was the man they cheered for. Most fighters would have slunk back down a division after such a loss, but Sam was still eager to mix it up with the big boys. One heavyweight brawler named Fireman Jim Flynn agreed to meet Langford. Flynn made some derogatory remarks towards Sam in the build-up to the fight, but Langford, all too familiar with these types of comments, still planned on giving the crowd a lengthy show. It wasn't until Sam discovered he was only getting paid a quarter the amount that Flynn was receiving when he said, "This is going to be the shortest fight you ever did see." Moments into the first round, Sam feinted with a right, then swiftly brought up a left uppercut that jarred Fireman Jim's jaw with such force that it was heard throughout all the arena. Flynn fell face first. He was muttering inaudible gibberish for 5 minutes before he started to make sense again. Almost 10 years later, Jim Flynn would knock out a young Jack Dempsey in the very first round. Sam's reason for fighting heavyweights was because the fighters in his own weight class, the middleweight division, weren't so eager to taste the tremendous power he possessed. Langford had to actively convince others to fight him, to the point where the press labeled him Beggar Sam. A man known as the Michigan Assassin was the champion at the time. With an impeccable record of 46 knockouts out of his 49 wins, is most remembered for the time he dropped heavyweight champion Jack Johnson.
Johnson is down. It was a terrific right to the jaw.
Stanley Ketchel was one of the all-time great middleweights, and he was a great fighter and a hungry fighter and a street fighter kind of a guy.
To get a shot at Ketchel's title, Langford first had to agree to meet him in a 6-round no-decision, non-title fight for little money. Sam wasn't happy about it, but he knew it was probably his only shot at getting a legitimate fight in the future. When the champion tried his famous Ketchel shift move to set up a knockout blow, he quickly discovered Langford's defensive prowess as he was no longer anywhere close enough for the punch to land. Sam made it a fast-paced fight, but made sure Ketchel had an even amount of success.
Langford was told not to hurt Stanley Ketchel, and Ketchel, midway through the fight, decided to try and knock out Sam Langford. Langford, in the course of defending himself, just brutalized Stanley Ketchel, but held back from knocking him out.
Some of the audience were of the opinion that Ketchel deserved the victory, having forced the action, but since the vast majority of punches didn't land, the other members of the crowd didn't see how he possibly could have won. The contest definitely entertained enough to warrant a rematch. Unfortunately, Sam never got his big money fight, as later that year, Ketchel was murdered on his farm by hired help. By 1910, Sam's main aspiration was to win the heavyweight world title. Jack Johnson was now the champion and had a disdain for Langford.
I fought Jack Johnson once before Johnson became champion, and Johnson wouldn't face him again. Just as Jack Johnson had chased Tommy Burns around the world. Nobody knows that Sam Langford chased Johnson around the world for a shot and kept chasing him. And when he finally cornered Johnson, Johnson's answer, drawing the color line, was, "Sam, nobody wants to watch two black men fight for the heavyweight championship."
Jack had once agreed on paper to give Sam a rematch, but then later reneged on his obligation. European fight fans, bitter over Johnson's avoidance of Langford, declared Sam to be the world's true champion.
Jack Johnson wanted easy matches, and easy money meant that the most deserving black challenger of the day, Sam Langford, would be forced to box in the shadows with little hope for a title shot. Instead, Langford fought other black boxers over and over, 10 times each against Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette.
Langford no longer had any issues dealing with heavyweights, and the fact that Sam could stop former Johnson opponents in a quicker and more impressive fashion only solidified the idea that he was the most deserving challenger. At one point, Langford's team offered up Johnson's prerequisite amount of $10,000 to fight him, but the looming Johnson-Jeffries mega fight shut down any negotiations. In 1912, Langford's hope of a rematch was finally extinguished when Johnson was charged with violating the Mann Act and would spend the rest of his time as champion in exile. Finding willing American opponents to face him was a serious problem for Sam, so he traveled the world and became a celebrity pugilist.
Langford went on to compete all over the world, with many fighters refusing to get in the ring with him, some because he was black, and others just because they feared him.
Sure was a different era in so many ways. Record keeping wasn't very good, but apparently he was in 200 to 600 fights.
International fans praised him for his exceptional power and fitness and loved his witty, quick-thinking trash talk. A Sam Langford fight was a can't-miss attraction. Mike Schreck was expected to put up a good fight, but Langford punished him so thoroughly in the first minute that the police stepped in and ordered the fight to end. John Lester Johnson beat and broke the ribs of a young Jack Dempsey, but couldn't stand up to Langford's vicious body assault. Light heavyweight champion Jack O'Brien was lucky to not have his title on the line, as he was out on his feet by the fifth. And up-and-coming great Harry Wills was knocked cold twice in two of their early duels. Langford made a fortune overseas and was told he'd be welcomed back with open arms should he ever return. By the end of the 1910s, Langford had outlived his best fighting days. He bore little resemblance to the chiseled fighter he was 10 years earlier. In a fight against Big Fred Fulton, Sam was hit by a right to the temple that severed a cord to the optic nerve. And after a pain that he described as 1,000 needles piercing his skull, Sam permanently lost his vision in his left eye. Langford didn't believe he'd make it to an old age and never exercised caution when spending his money. His days of living lavishly and helping out struggling fighters were over. Sam was broke. Knowing no one outside of boxing was going to employ a destitute, partially blind ex-fighter with no skills, Sam was forced to prolong his fighting days. He no longer had his judgment of distance and quick reflexes, but he was still capable of flattening even the biggest of men. The Roaring 20s had arrived, and with it, boxing's new cash cow, Jack Dempsey.
And he goes to plead with Jack Dempsey's manager, Doc Kearns, for a shot at Dempsey. And Kearns said, "Sam, we were looking for somebody easier." He was a blind man, one eye, 40 years old. That's how great Sam Langford was. And nobody's heard of him. For shame.
By the end of his career, all of his fighting prowess had gone. Managers now used the Langford name to build up their fighter's record, all at Sam's expense. Almost completely blind now, he depended on someone to guide him into the ring. His days as a pugilist officially ended in 1926 when he was stopped by a mediocre fighter in the second round. Despite a career of fighting the very best opposition in all weight categories, he was never rewarded with a title. If fate hadn't dealt Langford such a cruel hand, he probably would have been a 5-weight world champion. Although only surviving on handouts and benefit nights, Sam Langford never lost his joyful demeanor and positive outlook and was a man forever content.
He disappeared, and he was found in the early 50s, half-starved, living in a cellar in Boston. And they interviewed him, and Langford was an unusual man. He was never bitter. He said, "Well, I've got my guitar, I've got my memories, I'm okay."
In retirement, he went totally blind, and efforts were made to restore his sight.
Well, Sam, tell me, how long have you been ill?
I've been here for the last 5 years. I tell you, boys, it's great to be able to see again. When you can get out and look at the birds, young girls going by.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe.